In this video lesson, we'll explore the muscles of the human body, looking at the different muscle types found within the body, the overall function of skeletal muscles, and finally, we'll identify some of the major muscle groups. Within the human body, we have several forms of muscle tissue, and with this learning objective, we'll uncover each of these muscle types, their unique characteristics, and their function. There are three types of muscle found within the body, and these three types are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Although all these different types of muscles share some basic properties, each differ in terms of their microscopic anatomy, where they are found in the body, and the level of control we have over them. Our smooth muscle is found within the walls of our blood vessels and organs such as the stomach. Cardiac muscle is only found within the heart, and it's when this muscle contracts that a heartbeat is produced. Finally, as the name implies, skeletal muscle is found attached to the skeleton, and this type of muscle allows the body to move physically. Before we take an in-depth view at each muscle type, it's essential that we first define several terms, as we'll use these to describe each of the muscle types. Firstly, muscles can be striated or non-striated. A striation is the presence of alternating light and dark bands when the muscle is observed under a microscope. If muscles have this striped appearance, they are considered striated. If they don't, then they are considered non-striated. The level of control we have over a muscle is another defining characteristic. Muscles can either be under voluntary control, meaning that someone can consciously move the muscle or cause the muscle to contract. Other muscles are under involuntary control, and these muscles contract and relax without the conscious effort of an individual. If we think about an example of this, a person can control when they contract their skeletal muscles, but they can't control and contract their cardiac muscle. Finally, muscle fibers may branch, or they may stay as a complete unit. When muscle fibers split and connect to other muscle fibers, they are considered branched. If muscle fibers instead remain whole and represent a long cylinder, they're considered unbranched. Smooth muscle is found in the linings of hollow structures. This includes blood vessels, airways, and several internal organs such as the stomach and the intestines. Under the microscope, smooth muscle does not have any striations. Instead, it has a smooth appearance, which is where it gets its name. Smooth muscle is under involuntary control, and therefore it acts without the conscious effort of a person. Instead, it's under the control of the nervous system and other factors such as hormones, iron concentrations, and levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. This is important as this feature of smooth muscle allows processes such as breathing to occur without a conscious effort. Smooth muscle fibers are unbranched and have a spindle shape. They're wider in the middle, and then they taper off at both ends. While this shape may look like branching, each fiber remains as a single, whole cell. The main function of smooth muscle is to move substances throughout the body, whether this be the contraction of muscular layers of the stomach to break down food into chyme, or contraction of these muscles within the urinary system to allow urine to flow from the kidneys through the ureter to be stored in the bladder. Cardiac muscle is only found within the heart, and it makes up most of the heart wall, specifically the myocardial layer. If we look at this diagram, you can see areas with striations, remembering that striations are alternating dark and light bands, or areas where the muscle might appear striped. Cardiac muscle is also under involuntary control. This allows our heart to beat without us thinking about this process. And conversely, it means that we can't consciously stop our hearts from beating if we wanted to. The branching present in cardiac muscle fibers allows the electrical signal to travel quickly from one muscle fiber to the next. This causes rhythmic and coordinated contractions of the muscle tissue within the heart, ensuring that blood is pumped efficiently. The main function of cardiac muscle is to contract and facilitate a heartbeat, and the movement of blood throughout the chambers of the heart and into circulation. The final muscle type we'll discuss is skeletal muscle, and as the name suggests, it's attached to the skeleton. Skeletal muscle attaches to the bones via tendons, and their contraction allows us to move our body parts. Looking at this diagram here, you can again see very clear striations. These alternating light and dark bands are much more obvious and much more abundant than what's found in cardiac muscle. You can also see here that there are many nuclei present within these cells. This is because skeletal muscle has a high energy demand and requires a greater number of mitochondria to produce the energy that is required. Unlike the others, skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, meaning that we can consciously contract skeletal muscles to move our body. Skeletal muscle fibers are also unbranched, being long and cylindrical in shape. As we've mentioned before, our skeletal muscles serve many purposes. For instance, we can cause muscle contraction to move our bones within the skeleton. The contraction of skeletal muscle also produces heat as a byproduct, which is why you tend to shiver when you're cold. This is just the body's attempt to produce heat and restore temperature back to homeostatic ranges. Finally, skeletal muscle provides stability for our joints. For example, there are several muscles around the shoulder joint which not only allow the joint to move, but also provide stability. To recap all of this in a text format for you, firstly we have our skeletal muscle. This is attached to bones and permits movement and provides the skeleton with stability. Skeletal muscle fibers are striated and unbranched and are also under voluntary control. Cardiac muscle is only present in the heart, and its contraction allows for the rhythmic and efficient pumping of blood. Cardiac muscle is striated and branched, allowing electrical signals to pass quickly between muscle cells. And this muscle type is under involuntary control. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of hollow structures throughout the body, including the walls of blood vessels, airways, and organs such as the stomach. This type of muscle controls the movement of substances throughout the body. Smooth muscle gets its name because it has a lack of striations, and it's also unbranched and under involuntary control. If you're looking for a tool you can use to revise the different types of muscle, then this table is a great idea, given that it covers all the main elements of each muscle type. It'd be a great idea to create a blank table like this, and then fill in the answers in your own so you can practice. Our next learning objective for this video is to describe the structure and the organization of skeletal muscle. Just like the hierarchy of organization in the human body, where we begin with atoms and collectively move into larger structures such as cells, tissues, organs, and eventually big organ systems, our muscles start from tiny microscopic structures and eventually create the larger muscle unit. The smallest unit within a muscle are the filaments. When a series of filaments are grouped together, they form a myofibril. A collection of myofibrils form the muscle fiber, which is essentially a muscle cell. Muscle fibers then form bundles, known as fascicles, and we have a number of fascicles coming together. We then have a skeletal muscle. Now we'll look at these components in more detail, but before we do, I'm going to identify these structures using this diagram so you can understand how each of these contribute to the formation of the larger skeletal muscle unit. So here you can see we have the bone, and as we know, skeletal muscle attaches to bones via a piece of connective tissue called a tendon. As we move away from that attachment site, we move into our muscle tissue. In this diagram, we have a muscle cross-section, and this allows us to see that the muscle is made up of several smaller units, these being our fascicles. Fascicles can further be broken down into individual muscle fibers, or muscle cells, and these muscle fibers can further be separated into smaller components, known as myofibrils, and it's within the myofibril that we find our filaments. The muscle is the largest unit within the muscular system, and it's formed by a collection of fascicles coming together in the same location. Here in the diagram, we can see the muscle is the largest component within this system. We can also see that it's attached to the bone via a tendon. Fascicles are formed when several muscle fibers are bundled together, and the fascicles are contained by a layer of tissue that surrounds the entire structure. Here in the diagram we can see a whole fascicle. Towards the left of the image we have a closer view of the fascicle, and it's here that you can see that it's comprised of bundles of muscle fibers, and also that each fascicle is held together by a layer of connective tissue. Our muscle fibers are also known as the muscle cells. These are long and cylindrical in shape, and they contain the myofibrils. The myofibrils are small, thin, thread-like structures that are found within muscle fibers. The myofibrils also contain tiny fibers, with these known as filaments. Here's a slightly different diagram which shows you a closer view at the muscle fiber and myofibrils. You can clearly see that the muscle fiber contains a collection of myofibrils, but you can also see the filaments at the base of this image. Filaments are tiny protein structures found within the myofibril. There are two distinct forms of filaments. We have our thick filaments, called myosin, and then we have our thin filaments, which are called actin. As you can see, the filaments overlap with each other. At rest, there's minimal overlap between the filaments, and this is a state that's represented in our diagram here. During a muscle contraction, however, these filaments move, and this movement causes greater overlap between the myosin and the actin. Within the human body, there are over 600 skeletal muscles, and while learning each of these muscles is beyond the scope of this unit, it's important for you to know the location of just a few key muscle groups within the body, and broadly how skeletal muscle contributes to the movement of the skeleton. To begin this learning objective, we'll first discuss how the skeletal muscles contribute to skeletal movement, and then we'll identify several key muscle groups, starting at the upper body and moving down towards the lower body. When a muscle is activated, we call this a contraction. Muscle contraction involves several steps, but to summarize, the muscle is activated by the nervous system, and this signal causes the muscle to contract. When the muscle contracts, it shortens, and this is because the contraction reduces the distance between the thick and thin filaments within our myofibrils. As the muscle contracts and shortens, it pulls on the bone that it's attached to via the tendon, and this pulling results in movement of the bones. So to recap this, the nervous system signals the muscle to contract. When it does, the muscle shortens and it pulls on the bones that it's attached to, and this results in movement of our skeleton. If you'd like to know more about this process, then in your own time you can look into the sliding filament theory, which explains the detailed mechanics behind muscle contractions. However, you are not expected to study this theory or understand this process beyond what I've explained in this video. Now that we've outlined the basics of muscle contractions, we'll move into identifying several key muscle groups within the body. The deltoid muscles are the first group which we will identify, and these are a group of muscles which sit on top of the shoulder and wrap around the anterior, lateral, and posterior portions of the upper arm. If you place the palm of your hand on the front of your shoulder and allow your fingers to curve around towards the back of your shoulder, then you're palpating or feeling where the deltoid muscle sits. Looking at these images here on the screen, we have a diagram that's depicting the posterior view of the trunk. So essentially, we're just looking at the back of a person. In the image on the left, the arrow is pointing to the deltoids, while in the image on the right, we have highlighted the deltoids in blue to make them easier to identify. When the deltoids contract, the muscle shortens and pulls on the bone of the upper arm, with this being the humerus, and as a result, we have movement at our shoulder joint. The deltoids not only play an important part in movement of the upper limbs, but they're also a common site for intramuscular injections to be administered. The bicep muscle is probably a muscle many of you are familiar with. This muscle runs along the front of the upper arm, beginning in the shoulder region and extending down to the elbow. These diagrams are depicting an anterior view of the upper arm. So essentially, we are looking at the front of a person's arm. Again, in the image on the left, the arrow is pointing to the bicep, while in the image on the right, we have the bicep highlighted in blue. When the bicep contracts, the muscle again gets smaller, and this time the muscle pulls on the bones of the forearm. This causes movement at the elbow, bringing the forearm and hand closer to the shoulder. It's because of this movement that the biceps are heavily involved in activities of daily living. To engage in activities such as drinking water, we need to first bring the glass from the table towards our mouths, a movement that requires bending at the elbow. Other activities of daily living that also rely on the biceps include eating, dressing, showering, and toileting. The abdominal muscle group is again likely a muscle group many of you will have heard of before. This group consists of several muscles that are arranged in layers. In the diagrams here, we have an anterior view of the torso, and the image on the right highlights the abdominal muscle group for you. The abdominal muscles are essential for maintaining posture and stability. They also allow movement such as bending of the trunk, which is required in motions such as leaning forward to pick something up from the ground. These muscles are also involved in a number of common surgical procedures. For example, hernia repairs and cesarean sections, or C-sections, often require incisions through one or more layers of the abdominal muscle. In a C-section, surgeons will cut through layers of the abdominal muscles and the connective tissue to access the uterus. Often after these surgeries, individuals will have movement restrictions, as the body will have a reduced level of stability while these muscles heal. We then have several muscles which we'll collectively call the respiratory muscles in this video lesson. The respiratory muscles include the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. Breaking down the name intercostal, we can determine that these are the muscles that sit between the ribs, with inter meaning between, and costal referring to the ribs. In this group, we also have the diaphragm, which is the wide, flat muscle sitting underneath the ribs. And this is the main muscle responsible for starting the process of inhalation, or the intake of air. The image on the left shows you just how complex the trunk region is, with layers upon layers of muscle. For clarity, we have highlighted both the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm here in blue on the right, so that you can clearly identify these. When these muscles contract, they change the size of the chest cavity, either increasing or decreasing the space, depending on which muscle is involved, and whether we're inhaling or exhaling. The respiratory muscles are not only essential in the processes involved in breathing, but they also allow us to cough and clear our airways. They become especially important when a person is in respiratory distress, which is seen in clinical conditions such as asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, which is also known as COPD. The gluteal muscle group is commonly referred to as the glutes, and this group of three muscles is found on the posterior portion of the pelvis, in the buttocks region. These diagrams are a posterior view of the upper leg and hip. We have the arrow pointing to the gluteal muscles in the image on the left, while in the image on the right, the gluteal group is highlighted in blue. When the gluteal muscles contract, they shorten, pulling the hips forward and straightening the body. This motion is important in movements such as standing from a seated position, climbing stairs, and also in certain phases of walking. The gluteal muscles play an important role in a person's independence, given they're involved in activities such as standing and walking, but they're also a common site for certain intramuscular injections. The quadricep muscles are a group of four muscles, which is where the name for this group originates, as quad means four. This muscle group is located on the anterior portion of the upper leg, or more simply, on the front of a person's thigh. In these diagrams, we have an anterior view of the thigh, and in the image on the left, the arrow is pointing to the broad region in which the quadricep muscles are located, and the image on the right, the muscles are highlighted in blue. When the quadriceps contract, the muscles shorten, pulling on the bone of the lower leg, this being the tibia. This creates movement at the knee joint, causing the knee to straighten. The quadriceps attach to the lower leg via the patellar tendon, and this is a site commonly used for clinical reflex testing. In a patella reflex assessment, the patella tendon, or the site of where the quadriceps attach to the lower leg, it's tapped. If the reflex pathway is intact, the quadriceps will contract and the patient's knee will straighten in response. The hamstring muscle group is the final group we'll identify in this video lesson. The hamstrings are a group of 3 muscles that are located on the posterior portion of the upper leg, running from the hip down the back of the thigh to the lower leg. This diagram provides a posterior view of the upper leg. In the image on the left, the arrow is pointing to that general location of our hamstrings, while the image on the right highlights the hamstrings again in blue. When the hamstrings contract, the muscles shorten, pulling on the lower leg and causing the knee to bend. This action is essential for a person's mobility and independence, as bending the knee is required in activities such as walking and climbing stairs. In clinical falls protection programs, hamstring flexibility and strength are often targeted, particularly in individuals who shuffle their feet rather than lifting them properly when walking. In these cases, clinicians may focus on strengthening the hamstrings, simply to encourage more effective knee bending and improved walking mechanics. In this video, we uncovered the basics of the muscular system. And to recap some of our main points, we learned that there are 3 types of muscle found within the human body, these being smooth, cardiac, and skeletal muscle. Each of these muscle types has distinct features and characteristics. The muscle unit can be broken down into different components. We have the muscle, the fascicles, the muscle fiber, myofibrils, and finally, the filaments. When a muscle contracts, the muscle shortens, and this pulls on the bone, which the muscle is attached to, and hence the skeleton moves. And while there are many skeletal muscles within the body, you should now be able to identify several key skeletal muscle groups, such as the deltoids, bicep, abdominals, gluteal, quadriceps, and hamstrings.